In this week's video, we're going to be checking out a Sparmax airbrush. This model is the SP-35. As I mentioned earlier this year, I wanted to start checking out some of the established airbrush brands, the ones that have been around for a while that I just haven't purchased yet. And two brands were on the top of that list for me, Grex and Sparmax. We already checked out a Grex a month or two ago. So this week, let's take a look at this Sparmax. Again, this is the SP-35. And before we begin, an important disclaimer. As always, this review is no sort of promotion or advertisement for this brand. I do not accept free airbrushes for review on this channel. This one was not sent out to me. Just like every other review, I bought this one with my own money. I purchased this one on Amazon a few months ago. I thought it was a really good price. It was $67 US, and then after tax, it came to a bit over 70. So let's start with some objective stuff. This model, the SP-35, comes with a 0.35 millimeter needle and nozzle. That makes this one perfect for general use spraying. You can still get plenty of detail with a 0.35, and also it's going to be a little bit more forgiving than a true detail airbrush for thicker paints, but not as much as a 0.5 or higher. The SP-35 also comes with one of these smaller B-style paint cups. It holds 2 milliliters of paint. For what I do, that's plenty of paint. I really love the smaller cups just because you get a lot more room for your trigger finger. Your finger doesn't feel cramped in there like it does on some of the airbrushes with some larger cups. On the back of the airbrush, the SP-35 does come with a cutaway rear handle. And the purpose of this is that you can flush out anything within the cup by pressing down on the trigger and then just pulling back on this. So if you do want to use this option, it's there for you. When I bought this one, this airbrush comes packaged in a cardboard sleeve, and on the back there's a copyright for Iwata Sparmax. I looked this up on Sparmax's website, and since 2018, the two brands, Iwata and Sparmax, formed a joint venture. Sparmax is a Taiwanese company, so this airbrush is manufactured in Taiwan, and Iwata is a Japanese company. All of their airbrushes are manufactured in Japan. This model comes in this pretty cool looking plastic case. It's got some flake or glitter in the plastic, and it just kind of has this 90s retro vibe to it, which I think is cool looking. And inside here, you obviously get the airbrush, but you do get a few extras with it. There's a cheap plastic cleaning brush, which you don't often see included with an airbrush, but it's nice to see. And then here you get something very interesting. It's a second valve assembly, and this is called their single action valve. And so when you swap in this valve, the airbrush is constantly spraying air. If the compressor's on, it's spraying air. To me, it's a pretty odd feature. I haven't seen this from any other airbrush brand in the past. So if I connect this valve to the airbrush, you can see that there's no piston in there. It's just an opening. I'll add a quick disconnect so that I can add it to my air hose, and you can see what happens here when I plug it in. It just constantly sprays air. The only way to stop it is to either turn off your compressor and let it run out of air, or disconnect the air hose. So to me personally, I found this kind of an odd feature. I don't really know why anyone would want to use this, but the option is there if you do want it. And I do want to point out that when this valve is connected to the airbrush, you cannot press down. The trigger is always in the down position. That's why they call it single action. So it's kind of a different type of single action airbrush. It's not like the single action airbrushes that I'm used to, where you just press down, you get air and paint. With this one, the air is always going if it's connected to the compressor, and you control the paint by how far back you pull on the trigger. But of course, if you just use the normal valve that comes equipped on the airbrush, it works just like any other double action airbrush. It's not spraying air the whole time. You control the air by pressing down on the airbrush trigger. That opens that valve, releases air, and then you pull back for paint. And inside the box, you also get one of these stamped metal wrenches or spanners to remove the nozzle if you need to. And another thing in here that was very nice to see is an extra needle cap. So it comes with two needle caps. This one is a crown cap, and what's nice about that is you can easily see your needle inside, so you can clean off tip dry as you're painting. And you still get that benefit of needle protection when you're working close to your artwork. If you're just starting out in airbrush painting, even for the first year or so, I always recommend leaving one of these on. And finally, inside this box is some basic documentation, some pretty good information here on operating your airbrush. Underneath the macro lens, the finish and the chrome coating on this airbrush is excellent. There's nothing about the finish and build quality that feels cheap at all to me. It's very, very nicely made. And for under $70 US, I was very impressed with this. This is a really nice airbrush. Besides the more expensive, higher end airbrushes, I also own a lot of cheap airbrushes, a lot of them from $20 to $30 US. And the build quality on this one is a huge step up from any of those cheap airbrushes. This really feels like a premium airbrush. The only imperfections that I was able to find is down here at the bottom of the paint cup. You can see some of the marks from the machining process. It's not perfectly smooth like you'll see from other brands like Iwata. And this is underneath the macro lens, so it's going to be a little bit exaggerated. It's probably me being very nitpicky, but that's the only imperfections I could find. The airbrush is very nicely made. The needle and nozzle are also perfectly centered within the front of the airbrush, which is very important so that the airbrush sprays correctly and straight. And so just like always, I'm going to do a quick breakdown here so that you can see all the internal parts and how it's manufactured. The first thing that I'm removing here is the rear handle assembly. Then I'll unscrew the needle chucking nut to remove the needle. You can see this large screw right here that has some knurling on it. And this is called the spring case, which holds the spring right behind the trigger. But if you'd like, you could also adjust your spring tension with this. You could unscrew it a little bit to make that spring feel a bit softer. For me personally, when I'm painting, I want a good amount of tension. I have these tightened down all the way on all my airbrushes. But if I fully unscrew this, you'll see that it consists of 3 parts: the housing itself, the spring, and then the needle chucking guide. And this is the standard design that you'll see on most airbrushes like Iwata. It's very simple, they work great. And the nice thing is that the trigger lever is connected to that needle chucking guide, so it just makes it so much easier to disassemble when you need to. To remove the trigger, all you need to do is slightly rotate it and lift it straight up from the body of the airbrush. It doesn't have the piston connected. Instead, there's a small bar at the bottom of it, similar to what you'll see in some Iwata airbrushes like the Micron. There's a small notch underneath the trigger. This always goes toward the back of the airbrush when you reinstall it. And now this trigger design is nice and simple, something I always like and appreciate. It's very comfortable to paint with. There's also a few notches cut out on the top to give yourself a little bit more grip. Instead of the piston being connected to the airbrush trigger, you can see it's right down here within the body of the airbrush. The Iwata Micron has a design like this. You just need to be very careful not to lose that piston. And then moving along to the front of the airbrush, a very, very simple nozzle design. This is kind of the old school one where the nozzle is screwed into the body. Once the nozzle cap is removed, you can see the nozzle in here. Now, there's no reason to ever remove this unless you need to replace it. Or if you get a really bad clog, like something got into your airbrush that is in paint, otherwise just leave the nozzle on. A lot of airbrush companies will add a sealant to those threads and set it properly at the factory, so it's something you don't want to mess with unless you absolutely have to. And so that's it for the breakdown. It's a nice simple build, which is something that I always appreciate. Besides how an airbrush sprays, one of the most important things to me is the build quality. And I have to say that on this Sparmax SP-35, everything was great. The machining and the manufacturing was excellent. And so finally, to finish this video up, let's get into the most important part of the airbrush. That's how it sprays paint. I'm starting this one out like normal, just spraying a few dots here, testing the trigger control rate. And I have to say that the trigger response is insanely good. I just pull back the smallest amount on the trigger, just slightly nudge it back by applying some pressure, and I get a dot of paint every single time. Now, I personally am very, very picky with this, maybe a little bit more than most people, but I think that this one is absolutely perfect. It reminds me very much of any Iwata airbrush. And one of the best ways to test out the trigger response is to write out a few letters or a few words. And write them out in print like what I'm doing here, not cursive, because it's about starting and stopping the airbrush. So I wrote out the word airbrush really small. It's like the size of my fingernail, and it did an amazing job. So great job on the response rate. And for painting fine lines, this airbrush is excellent. But to be fair, you could do this with any airbrush 0.35 or smaller. And so I can easily paint a line just as thin, if not thinner, than a human hair. And then for the line consistency test, just as I expected, it did a perfect job. Very smooth, even line, no sort of breaks within the paint. You will notice toward the end of this line a little bit of spidering, but that was my fault. I have this paint over reduced and I just pulled a little bit too far back on the trigger. In a week or two, I'm going to have a tutorial up showing you how to paint a black and white portrait, the one you're seeing on the screen right now. And for the majority of this painting, I was using my Iwata Micron, but I switched over to this one, the Sparmax, for just darkening up some parts of this ear, and I absolutely loved it. It definitely has a wider spray pattern than something like a Micron because it is a much larger nozzle at 0.35 over 0.18, but the control was so good that I was really able to do anything I wanted with it. One thing that surprised me that I noticed as soon as I started painting with it is the very low airspeed. As long as an airbrush atomizes paint well, the airspeed doesn't really matter that much, as long as the airbrush is working properly. But this is where preference comes in because my favorite airbrush is an Iwata Micron, and one thing that I love about it is the very, very low airspeed. When you're working very close to the surface, that airspeed is so low that you don't really feel that air blowing back off the surface you're painting. You don't feel that turbulence like you do in some other airbrushes. And for me personally, that's what I got used to all these years using an Iwata Micron, so that's what I prefer. It just feels so comfortable to me, but again, it's a preference. With an Iwata Micron, this is the Micron Takumi, spraying at 20 psi, I get an airspeed right around 4 meters per second. Switching over to an Iwata Eclipse at the same distance, it's a much higher airspeed, right around 6 meters per second. And trust me, you feel that airspeed difference right away when you switch from a Micron to an Eclipse. And the Sparmax SP-35 is much closer to the Micron, right around 4.5 meters per second. And to me, it just felt so comfortable. Usually when I switch from my Micron to another airbrush, I have to drop the PSI a little bit. And painting with this Sparmax airbrush was just so comfortable to me. I loved using it. Even spraying at higher PSIs, the airspeed didn't feel too high. So obviously, I was very impressed with this airbrush. Definitely one I would fully recommend, especially at the price point. You could pick this up for under $70 US. I'm not sure how they keep the quality this high at such a low price point, but this airbrush is fantastic. And I know that Sparmax is a company that's been around for a long time, so they clearly have figured it out. So that's it for my review. Awesome airbrush. If you collect them like I do, definitely pick one of these up. You're going to love it. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you back here next Friday.